Hello, I'm Jack Fink, and you're watching Eye on Politics on CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth. Early voting begins Monday, and the major race in Texas is for governor between two-term incumbent Republican Greg Abbott and Democrat Beto O'Rourke. Governor Abbott's campaign is predicting historic voter turnout in Texas, with as many as 10.6 million people casting their ballots. One key part of the electorate is the Hispanic community. When you look at recent polls, they show large differences in who Latino voters will support for governor. As Republican Governor Greg Abbott and Democrat Beto O'Rourke campaign across Texas, they have focused a lot of effort on the Latino community. Jason Villalba is CEO and board chair of the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation, a nonpartisan nonprofit group whose mission it is to better understand the Hispanic population here.
Hispanics all across Texas share some level of history and understanding and cultural affinity, but their politics are quite different all around the state.
You can see that in the recent polls for Abbott and O'Rourke. Two polls, Quinnipiac University and Marist College, show a 1 percentage point lead for O'Rourke over Abbott. The Spectrum News Siena poll gives O'Rourke an 18 percentage point lead, while Villalba's Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation poll gives O'Rourke a 15 percentage point lead over Abbott. The Dallas Morning News UT Tyler poll shows O'Rourke is ahead by 4 percentage points, while the Hill Emerson poll shows Abbott has a 4 percentage point lead over O'Rourke. O'Rourke, who speaks Spanish, told me it's important for him to talk with Hispanic voters directly.
And the ability to connect with those voters in Spanish and answer questions in Spanish and connect on the economy, on jobs, on inflation, on improving our schools and expanding Medicaid, and to do that in Spanish is so important.
The governor, whose wife, First Lady Cecilia Abbott, is Latina, told me his party's policies and beliefs attract Hispanic voters.
The Hispanic community believes in 3 core principles: faith, family, and freedom. And they know it's the Republican Party who supports those concepts. Second thing is they believe in a secure border.
The crisis at the southern border has helped Republicans make gains in the Rio Grande Valley, but Villalba says there's a limit to how much that will help statewide.
So even though there might be a slight shift in that one region, the numbers of individuals down there just won't really be an impactful factor for a statewide race.
Many political analysts are predicting Republicans will regain control of the U.S. House. But what about the Senate? This week we asked Senator John Cornyn how confident he is that his party will become in the majority after the election.
Well, I'm very confident that we will take the House. Historically, as you know, Jack, in the midterms post-presidential election, the party out of power usually picks up seats. We have a lot of very hotly contested seats for the Senate, mainly because of a lot of retirements in places like North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri, just to name a few. And so we've had a lot of tough primaries. But I think the number one issue that is confronting the voters here in Texas and across the country is inflation. A lot of the policies of the current administration, the amount of money that they've spent, has been inflationary. We're at the 40-year high in terms of inflation. It has a very direct kitchen table impact on the price of food, the price, obviously, of gasoline and everything else. And so I think that's the number one issue. I mean, obviously, I hope that my party wins the majority in the Senate, because we've seen how important it is where the Senate is in the personnel business. We're the only body that votes on, for example, filling federal appointment vacancies for the bench or U.S. attorney and the like. So it's very important for us to be in a strong posture. But ultimately, we're going to be a check on the White House.
Cornyn spoke in Dallas after hosting a panel discussion on the dangers of the powerful synthetic opioid fentanyl, which killed more than 1,600 Texans last year and 71,000 people nationwide. Like them or not, polls are part of the political process gauging voter support for candidates. But should we trust them? We spoke with Dr. Thomas Gray, assistant professor of political science at UT Dallas, about this issue.
I won't go so far as to say we shouldn't trust polling, but that rather we should interpret the polls cautiously and with a bit of humility, understanding that there are limits. It's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is they're probably the best information that we have. And the bad news is they're also still limited and potentially flawed. And so we have to not throw them out entirely, but we have to read them and interpret them with a knowledge of their limitations.
And so when you're talking about this, do any polls recently stand out, good or bad?
So there's a difference between a poll, a single poll, and the way that we more often think about them, which is the collection of the polls, averaging the polls. So we can look at the elections, the statewide elections in 2020, so less than 2 years ago, and the polls for that election were fairly systematically off. And that was also true in 2016 and to a much lesser degree in 2018. So we can look back and say, collectively, the polls missed the election actual result by a meaningful amount in 2 of the last 3 elections and in some of the individual Senate races in 2018.
Any of them here in Texas, or do you think the polls here in Texas were pretty, right on?
So if you look back at the recent governor and Senate elections, as well as the state's contribution to the presidential elections, the polls have missed the actual result in Texas by about 3 to 4.5 percentage points over the last 4 or 6 years. So the last 3 election cycles. And that's actually not that bad. That's sounds like that's a pretty big error, right? That would mean if you see one candidate leading by 3%, there's a meaningful chance that the poll is off by enough that that's actually an even race based on recent history in Texas. But that's not actually bad compared to the rest of the country. In 2020, in Senate races, for example, at least 4 different states had their polls off by 5 percentage points or more. And in Maine, Senator Susan Collins was reelected despite never leading in any of the polls before, in the months preceding her election. And she actually won by about 8.5%. So the polls were off there by potentially more than 10, percentage points. And so Texas's polls have been not that bad compared to the rest of the country, but we still have to keep in mind they have on average been off by 3 to 4.5 percentage points.
Now, every poll has what's called a margin of error. Are you saying that the Texas polls as a whole were within the margin of error?
It's not quite. So in an individual poll, the typical margin of error is about 3 percentage points. And that comes from the fact that most individual polls are about 1,000 respondents, 800 to 1,000 respondents, which gives you a margin of error of about 3 percentage points. But when we average polls, they should start to do better. We have more information. We have many different polls, and they should actually get to something more like 2 percentage points, 1 percentage point, if all it was just a little bit of random chance. So the fact that the error is still worse than that tells us that there are other things involved besides just bad luck, besides just random error.
What do you attribute that to?
In political science, we call it non-response bias, which is this simple fact your viewers may relate to, which is if you get a call or your friends get a call, do they answer and answer the poll? And the truth is, almost no one actually answers the polls. Pollsters used to be able to get, say, 20% of the people that they called to actually participate. And then maybe 10 years ago, it was 10%. And then 2 or 3 election cycles ago, it was 4%. Now it's 1%. And I saw a recent description of a New York Times Siena poll in which they said it was 0.2%, meaning they call 500 people to get 1 person who responds. And the main problem there is that means the 1,000 people in the poll aren't really random. So there's more than just random chance there. There's the fact that some people are just much more likely to actually answer the poll than other people. In fact, the people who answer the polls are the ones who are unusual. The 499 others hung up the phone or just said, no, I don't want to participate, or didn't answer at all. And that means there's a real risk that if the same type of people who are more likely to respond are also more likely to vote for a Republican or vote for a Democrat, it can introduce bias. And when I say bias, I don't mean the pollster is trying to get one result or another. It's a statistical term, meaning that the result will be systematically off in one direction or another.
So what's the solution?
The solution that pollsters attempt to use is to try to weight the sample that they get, the actual people who respond, to weight them to try to look like what they think the electorate who actually shows up to vote will look like. So when they look at the actual people who answer, they look at those demographics and they recognize those aren't the demographics of the actual voting population in the state or the country that they're polling. And so they attempt to modify that a bit to fit that end electorate that they expect. But that's a very inexact science. And it may be an art, really. You know, there's a kind of lack of rigor and imprecision in that to a certain extent. It's impossible to get that exactly right. And that's why if you're off by 3 or 4 percentage points, if you're not controlling for the right demographic factors, you know, you can produce a poll that's off by 4 percentage points. And it might say one candidate is leading by 2, and in fact, the other one is leading by 2. And that can lead to these systematic biases in the poll results.
So let me ask you, because before you spoke about an average of polling. And so one entity that does that is Real Clear Politics, and you know, the Real Clear Politics average of polls. And so I'm wondering what you think of that and how reliable that is. And specifically, when you look at the Texas governor's race, the Real Clear Politics average shows Governor Abbott up about 8.5 percentage points over Beto O'Rourke. And I know that they change the averages they cut off older polls and they do more recent polls. So what do you make of that?
So this is something that was innovated about 20 years ago and has really grown with prominence with Real Clear Politics and their perhaps biggest rival, 538, which both kind of have slightly different ways of doing the same thing. It's a very sound idea because in political science and the people who follow the polling world, we say we should never really draw much information from a single poll. So an organization puts out a specific poll result, and we say, don't dwell on it, don't read into it, put it into the average, and then look at the average. Just put it in the average. So I really like what Real Clear Politics does. I like what 538 does. 538 gives you a slightly different average, and it's because they each have different standards for how they interpret the results and which ones they include and which ones they don't and when they cut it off. So you can get slight variations, but they generally come out within a couple points of each other. And I think that's a much better example to look at. And I think one of the reasons is we all are prone to confirmation bias. We seek out information that helps us. So if you are a Democrat and a poll comes out and it says you're even, and then the actual average says you're down by 8.5, you are much more likely to look at that one poll and really put a lot of weight on it because it tells you the thing that you wish to see. And the same is true for Republicans when a poll comes that's much better than their average. But they should really focus on that average, that average of polling, because it's just going to be much more accurate, because it's filtering out a lot of the random variation in individual polls, and it keeps you from engaging in that effort of confirmation bias, of picking just the polls that tell you the thing you want to see, and instead makes you look at all of them.
And do you have, just listening to you, I would imagine, do you feel as if the average of polls, let's just say in the governor's race, since we were talking about it, is accurate?
Yes, that's probably the best information we have. Like I said, the average of polls in the elections, the statewide elections in Texas, have been off by 3 to 4.5 percentage points in recent cycles. So that average will still be, very likely still be off by some amount, but it's still going to be a better gauge than any individual poll and other things we might look at, like, campaign donations are generally not as good of predictors as, polls. Things like attendance to rallies, counting the number of signs in yards as you ride around, or just asking a few of your friends what they think. Those are less predictive indicators. They're not as strong, but we should be mindful that the polls still have had they still have flaws and limitations that we should keep in mind.
I do have a couple of other questions. Based on what you said, does that mean if the polling average for the governor's race is 8.5 percentage points, in other words, that the governor has that 8.5 percentage point lead over O'Rourke? So are you saying on election night it could be either, like a 5.5 percentage point difference, or, on the flip side, a 12-point difference?
Either of those would be in the range of normal results. And also larger differences would be possible if you look beyond Texas. So the results from 2020 that I referenced, where some other states had very large gaps, those are within the realm of possibility. There's no hard wall that says the polls can't be off by more than 5 percentage points. There's no line there. But if you look within the range of the most common results, you can sort of add 3 or 4 points on either side of the number. And that is going to generally be the most frequently observed outcomes when election day actually shows up.
And my last question to you, and I appreciate your time very much, Professor, and that is, I recently did a story about the inconsistency among the different Texas polls in the governor's race when it comes to the Hispanic vote. Some polls showed Beto O'Rourke with, double-digit leads, 16 to 22 percentage point leads over Governor Abbott. Others showed a tie, basically, or like a 1-point difference. And there's one poll that showed the governor up by 2 percentage points. Why is it so different? And what does that tell you? That we shouldn't trust any of them?
One thing is, once you start looking at subgroups, so if you subset and you say young people or a specific racial or ethnic group or anything that's a subset of the population, the actual randomness there is going to go up, because now you're looking at a smaller and smaller group. And you can think also about my comment about the 1%, calling 100 people to get one, or calling even 500 people to get one. The actual number of Hispanics in a poll that answer the call may end up being extremely small. So you could end up with just a handful, or just a few dozen people in a poll that are determining that group, that subset's role in the poll. And then the pollsters are projecting what will that percentage look like? What will the Hispanic percentage of the electorate be? And they don't exactly know. They have to project that a bit. And what will be the breakdown between younger and older people within a particular group? It's a very complicated process. And so different pollsters take different approaches to trying to correct for that fact that the group of people that they are going to end up having in their poll that actually respond to their poll is going to be disproportionately white, educated, affluent, and Democratic supporting. And they are trying to make that match what will actually occur. And that can often mean really doing a lot with specific subgroups, such as Hispanic Americans, African Americans. And that means that looking at a poll and digging into those subgroups and saying this one says, 60% and this one says 50%, you just have to accept that there's a lot of imprecision there. And making those kind of projections, I would not feel very confident in doing. I would wait. I would really wait on that and see what the actual results are and the actual vote tallies, and look at some post-election research that can verify who actually voted with voter files and things like that. And I would avoid, using those crosstabs in the polls, to make any grand conclusions at this point.
So if I were to hear you correctly, you're basically saying if you look at the consistency and the average of a state poll just as a whole, that's probably the most reliable way to look at things and how a race is shaping up.
Yes. And if it is close, understand that either result is still very possible. If those numbers are close, then it's very possible in either direction.
Dr. Thomas Gray, Assistant Professor of Political Science at UT Dallas, thank you so much for your insight and for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
The midterm election will likely shift the political power structure in Congress. To talk more about this, we're joined by CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian in Atlanta. Welcome, Nicole. So will control of the U.S. Senate change? And one of the key races is in Georgia, where you are right now. How important is that to both political parties?
Well, Georgia is absolutely critical, especially for Republicans if they're seeking to take the majority, because they want to flip this seat. And so that's why you see a Herschel Walker bus right behind me. We were at one of his campaign events where he was joined by South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, who said that he is confident about Republicans' chances. And of course, this race remains exceedingly close. Both candidates, Herschel Walker and Senator Raphael Warnock, have only been separated by, at times, a point or two. So this really could go either way. And important to remember about Georgia, there's also the potential for this race to go to a runoff if no one gets 50%. So certainly as a whole, this is one race that nationally a lot of folks are looking closely at. But there are a number of toss-up races that will also be a determining factor, whether that's Nevada, whether that is Pennsylvania, whether that is Wisconsin, Ohio. There are a number of critical races that really will affect the balance in the Senate. And so that's why in these final weeks you see a number of campaigns that really stepping up their messaging, bringing out their surrogates to try to close the deal with voters.
Many analysts believe the Republicans will regain the majority in the House. How do the latest numbers look? What does the latest polling show about control of the House?
Well, in terms of our latest CBS News battleground tracker, what it shows is that things are stabilizing for Republicans. We are still estimating, based on our battleground tracker, that Republicans are poised to take the majority. But whereas we had seen their margin shrinking in terms of the number of seats that they could potentially pick up, again, now that number is stabilizing. And so we're projecting that they could pick up or secure 224 seats. As you know, 218 are needed for the majority. So that is kind of what we're seeing in terms of our polling. Of course, there's other polling out there. The New York Times, for instance, a Siena poll that recently came out that also showed that Republicans do appear to have the momentum in terms of the folks that they surveyed, and people suggesting that they are leaning more towards supporting Republicans, particularly independents, which is notable, in large part motivated by issues like the economy and inflation. Democrats, on the other hand, argue that some of these polls are outliers, and Speaker Pelosi in particular still remaining very bullish about the chances of retaining the majority.
And given the recent polling showing that inflation and the economy are the most important issues to voters, and abortion has dropped among top concerns, what impact will that have on each party's messaging?
Well, you know, in terms of Democrats' messaging, I don't know that it will really have a significant impact, because many Democrats continue to argue that they feel that abortion rights is a critical issue for their base. And in terms of talking to voters, it does come up, especially talking to a lot of women who are concerned about their rights and the rights of their daughters. So it is an issue that is still front and center for a lot of people. And Democrats, of course, we saw the president even address the issue recently. So that being said, you know, Democrats also acknowledge that they are talking about those pocketbook issues, but that by far has been more of the central messaging that we have seen from Republicans, who really for well over a year now have been talking about inflation, who have been talking about the economy, consistently arguing that Democrats aren't paying enough attention to it, and that's why they believe that they should get the majority this fall.
CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian in Atlanta, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And be sure to see more of the latest political reporting tonight on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, right here on CBS 11 News at 5:30 p.m. That's all for Eye on Politics this week. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jack Fink. You're watching CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth.